officers, as in any profession, will always get in trouble. And the question is whether there is an adequate response to that misconduct that can be verified by the public so that the public trusts the police work.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. The following presentation is brought to you in part by the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, which supports our First Amendment and Free Press program, where we bring local journalists into communities and online to discuss their work and the value investigative journalism has in our democracy. Many thanks to the SPJ Foundation for its support. I'm here today with Erin Rhoda of the Bangor Daily News. Erin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Erin, you and your colleagues just released a series looking into the lack of transparency and accountability in county sheriff's offices. Can you give us a quick summary of your work and some of the takeaways?
Sure. So what I learned over the course of our reporting was that sheriffs stand out from nearly every other licensed professional when it comes to oversight. So no one can place them on administrative leave while they're being investigated for infractions or even potential crimes. There is no recall process written into law for sheriffs, as there is for elected municipal officials. Because they are elected, the Maine Constitution says that sheriffs can only be removed by the governor, which is a pretty high bar, whereas an appointed police chief can be fired by their local town manager. There are also lots of different types of misconduct that Maine's police overseer, the Maine Criminal Justice Academy, does not have the authority to punish officers, police and corrections officers for. And this is different from the oversight of other licensed professionals. So while a doctor could lose his or her license for propositioning a patient or sending explicit photos to a patient, a sheriff or any officer in Maine would not even have their certification questioned. And so all of this connects to the former sheriff of Oxford County, Wayne Gallant, because he was investigated both internally by the county commissioners and criminally by the FBI in 2017. And no one could place him on administrative leave as they would have for any rank and file officer. And it allowed him to allegedly destroy evidence of what he had done. And what he had done was confirmed by that independent internal investigation and also through my own reporting. And I was able to find at least 5 people who had received explicit photos or messages propositioning them for sex. One of or 2 of those people were his employees. And so he kept his certification as a law enforcement officer because the Maine Criminal Justice Academy doesn't have the authority to decertify officers for violations of the Maine Human Rights Act, such as sexual harassment. And when I talked to people, the point that they kept returning to was that sheriffs exist to uphold the law. And it could be argued that they even have more power than police chiefs because they patrol entire counties, they run the county jails. But when they abuse their authority, there's limited recourse to hold them accountable, and that this can affect the public's trust in law enforcement.
So tell us a little bit about the reporting that went into the series. Obviously, the series is so important because it looks at sheriffs that are in positions of power and how they're not being held accountable for their actions. But a main part of these stories that you're reporting has to do with some very sensitive content, whether it's working with the victims of sexual harassment or questions about whether or not you should publish or how to present these graphic images that were sent to the victims of the harassment. Maybe you can pull back the newsroom curtain for us a little bit and tell us a bit more about the reporting that was involved and some of the conversations you and your colleagues had about how to present this sensitive material.
Yeah, so Going back to the beginning, we started down this path in a coffee shop, just myself and two other reporters talking about this case with Gallant. And, that was about a year ago, back when we could do that sort of thing, have a conversation together in a coffee shop. But I do find it tricky to talk about the reporting process because it is so different day to day, week to week, throughout the course of an investigation. And as you can imagine, sexual harassment, misconduct among law enforcement, it is not a subject that people readily want to talk about. And so people have settlement agreements that make it harder for them to talk publicly. Everyone I speak to or try to speak to is deeply human. They have kids, they worry about what they will think. They live in small communities where people know them. Some of the key people I was speaking to are still police officers and have to think about their jobs and whether they want to trust me. And so for me, I end up approaching every conversation differently, always with great care and humanity and preparation. And so sometimes just contacting people, as you might know, is a challenge. So I have handwritten letters to reach people. I have driven 3 hours in a blizzard to reach people. And when people didn't reply to my requests, for comment, I tried reaching them through people who knew them. I think one thing that is important and something that I have learned as a journalist is to never try to pressure people who have experienced violence or abuse of power to speak with me. So I try to have a conversation. I try to lay out the options and try to talk about how it can work and really gauge whether they're ready, because the last thing that I want is for my journalism to re-traumatize people. And so on the documentation end of things, getting records through Maine's Freedom of Access Act really was the reason we were able to do this investigative series, because we could confirm the human stories that way. So through emails, through settlement agreements, through human rights complaints, through discipline records, through many other records, we were allowed to see what people had already told us or what people couldn't or wouldn't speak about. And so you need both. You need those records, you need those human voices to be able to do this work. And it is very important when you're putting everything together to be so sensitive to what you know, what you can show, what you can prove, what you can verify. Everything that is in our stories, you might not always see the sourcing that goes into it, but everything is very heavily sourced. And there are many people we spoke to who could confirm information for us, but could not do it on the record. And so we were able to find other ways, to confirm that information. But we had our tip through somewhere else and could pull it all together.
I'm glad you brought up the Freedom of Access Act because in my daily work, I'm very much advocating for stronger public record laws. But to those that don't have a legal background or don't work in a newsroom like yourself, I think the idea of public records and why we need access to these public records can be lost sometimes. It's hard to really connect public record laws to people's day-to-day lives. So I appreciate you putting it into these terms, because really without these records, then you don't have the emails, you don't have the documents you need to confirm the off-the-record stories that you're sharing. And I think, and tell me if you would agree, but without strong public record laws, we're not going to hear the stories that you're now reporting and sharing with us. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's important to say that that Maine's Freedom of Access Act is stronger in some respects than in other states. And so here, discipline records for police, for corrections officers are public, and that isn't the case everywhere. If those records weren't public, we would not have been able to have done a broader look at misconduct among officers across the state. But I will say that the law also presents some challenges. So when you file a request for public information, a government agency has 5 days to let you know that they got it. And then they can take whatever is determined to be a reasonable amount of time to provide those records. And so when we began digging into officer misconduct across the state, not just in Oxford County, and we asked for the last 5 years of their discipline records. And some counties provided those records extraordinarily quickly, like within a matter of a week or 2 weeks. And then other counties took as long as 6 months. And then we still have one county that has not provided the records at all. So we also found that even if you do have, even if you know what is public, public officials don't always know what is public. And so we had, one instance where a county sent us back, hundreds of pages of records and had redacted a lot of it that they really should not have. And so, we had a conversation about, well, this needs to be unredacted. They did, but they didn't unredact everything that they should have. We had to go through about 3 different rounds to get it right. And so I also think we can see instances where the public records law does perhaps does not extend far enough, and that could be open to debate. But one thing that it doesn't allow us to see is unsubstantiated cases of discipline. And so we don't have a good idea of what was reported to a sheriff's office, and then the sheriff's office determined, we don't have enough information or evidence to proceed in this case. And it's a similar story at the state level. So you can't see the cases of you can't see the case files of unsubstantiated cases at the Maine Criminal Justice Academy. So that's the agency that can decertify officers. So while this is done to protect officers from baseless claims, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to see how the academy decided not to move forward and punish an officer. And there are some cases we found where we believed the public could benefit from knowing why an officer didn't lose his license. And in one of those cases, which we detail in one of our 8 stories, an officer was fired twice from 2 different agencies for alleged violence against his family. And each time the academy declined to punish him. And it only decertified him when he was finally convicted in 2016 of theft, perjury, and tax evasion.
That's such a great point, because especially over the last several months with this national conversation about police accountability and how do we provide more transparency within law enforcement agencies, there's this ongoing discussion about, well, what about reports of misconduct that are, like you said, unsubstantiated? What is the value to the public in getting that information? And it sounds like here, really the value is learning more about the system and whether it's working and whether or not those allegations of misconduct are actually being investigated as they should be, and there is accountability on the other end. To that point, you and your colleagues put together a great database looking at, I think, the last 5 years of disciplinary records. Can you tell me a little bit more about this database, the work that that went into it, and what your plans are for the future?
Yeah, sure. So no one had ever before looked at police misconduct on a statewide level in Maine. And so we filed public records requests with all 16 Maine counties and asked for those records, as you said, over the last 5 years. And one of my reporters, Josh Keefe, discovered in going over all, those many pages of records was that in about a third of the files that documented serious discipline, it was just not possible to tell what had happened. And so there are instances where officers were fired and we don't know why. And this really became one of our stories that, even if records are public, it doesn't always mean that there's transparency because there are no rules around what should be in these records. And so they are our biggest window, perhaps, into police misconduct on the local level. And about a third of those documenting serious discipline are essentially useless. And so we ended up creating this database, and this was a discussion like, why should we publish a database if, a lot of the records, it's not clear what happened. And so we did it to actually show which counties were being forthright about their officers' misconduct and then which counties were not. And so we went through and you can see, yes, there is enough information in this instance. No, there's not enough information here. And I think the point was that officers, as in any profession, will always get in trouble. And the question is whether there is an adequate response to that misconduct that can be verified by the public so that the public trusts the police work. And so the database, it only includes the severe disciplines. So that's suspensions, demotions, firings, or resignations in lieu of firings when we could determine that. And it allows the public to see which sheriffs have documented clearly and in detail the misconduct of their officers, and then which sheriffs have not done that.
Will this database be updated moving forward? What are your plans for the future of this database?
At a minimum, we're definitely going to update it when we receive records back from the last county that has not fulfilled the public records request yet. And, we have also asked for discipline records from the Maine State Police. So this is, the statewide police agency, and we are yet to receive those as well. So we need to have a discussion about how to, put those, how to weave those into some of this that we've already produced.
That's great. It's a tremendous resource, and I would suggest everyone check it out. Not often can you find the disciplinary records for any law enforcement agency all in one place and have it be as accessible as your database is. Lastly, Erin, before we wrap up here, I know you hit upon this, throughout our conversation at various points, but if you could, again, for those that aren't journalists, aren't attorneys, don't, spend their days monitoring law enforcement and looking for transparency, can you really emphasize why all of this work, all of this time and effort, and all the energy that you and your colleagues at the Bangor Daily News have put into the series matters? Why is it important? Why should the everyday citizen who doesn't typically think about these issues, why should they care?
This is something that my reporters and I have actually talked about. They're Callie Ferguson and Josh Keefe, both amazing journalists. And there are a number of reasons why this type of journalism is important. And I'll say, like, as we published our stories, we heard from so many people that they learned something new about their community, and that they want there to be more oversight of officers who misbehave. And so I think a lot of the discussion nationally has focused on officers who kill people. But there is a whole range of misconduct that can destroy the public's trust in law enforcement. And I've said that before about, the public's trust in law enforcement. This type of reporting is important, not just for the public, but I think for officers themselves, because many of the abuses that we uncovered were directed towards other officers. And we really tried to engage officers in discussions about these issues of oversight. And we learned that, some sheriffs and many officers also want to see changes. And I think that is important for the public to know as well. So I think this leads to another point that investigative journalism is important because it raises questions that no one has really considered asking before. And by asking those questions, we ended up prompting lawmakers and law enforcement to question why they do things the way they do. And certainly, such as from Maine's police overseer, we heard a lot of, that's not our job. But then we can ask, well, should it be your job? Uh, People might assume that in Maine, which is a relatively small state, that we will, hold each other accountable, that police will hold each other accountable. But we can see based on this reporting that that does not happen, especially when there are settlement agreements that hide misconduct, um, when hiring agencies aren't required to look into a past officer's history, and when, even if they did, the records might not be complete. And so bringing all of that to light is the very real job of investigative journalism. And now it's up to others to act on that work.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to share your work with us today.
Thank you so much.